Somebody, one of my colleagues, suggested that I start this with an extended Game of Thrones metaphor, talking about winter's coming, dragons, kings. Full disclosure, I've never watched Game of Thrones. So we will start by introducing the panel, and then we're going to have a bit of a chat. I have named this Everything You Want to Know About MONEYVAL, but we're afraid to ask because I think it's really important. There are no stupid questions out there. If we don't understand this forthcoming process that's going to happen in October 26, we cannot respond as an island jurisdiction. So first of all, we've got Jilly Christian. So Jilly is the head of our AML CFT policy office for the Isle of Man. She leads the coordination for the MONEYVAL mutual evaluation and national risk assessment, as well as taking a central coordinating role generally in our response to financial crime. She serves as head of delegation to MONEYVAL and brings experience, real life experience in evaluation from the Secretariat in Strasbourg. She's also held roles in the FIU and the FSA. So welcome, Jilly. Shannon Reid is the AML CFT advisor at the Gambling Supervision Commission. She supports internal preparations for our forthcoming MONEYVAL mutual evaluation. If anybody wants to keep a list of the number of times I say MONEYVAL, then we'll have a prize at the end. She previously worked in the Cabinet Office's AML CFT policy office and is a trained MONEYVAL assessor under the revised FATF methodology, for which we're going to be assessed next year. And Shannon contributes to national efforts through her role in the policy and outreach team. Finally, Goerge Pearmain. Goerge advises countries globally on building effective AML CFT regimes aligned with FATF standards. He was head of delegation for Jersey during its 2024 mutual MONEYVAL evaluation. And I really want to explore that, understand what worked well, what didn't work well there, so we can learn for that here. Goerge has conducted numerous FATF and MONEYVAL assessments. He trains assessors and previously worked for the FATF Secretariat in Paris. And you've just heard from Liam. So I'm going to start with you, Liam. Let's keep it on a roll. I guess I was really taken by that importance of the narrative and how we present ourselves to the outside world. It's always good to learn from the kind of bad examples, isn't it? But from your perspective, how important is IO1 in contributing to the overall evaluation that we're going to undertake?
It's absolutely critical. I think I made this point early on in my presentation. If you get this wrong, if you don't identify risk accurately, it is impossible to devise policy and treat effectively. So that IO1 around risk policy coordination is the cornerstone to the rest of the process. You can look further down the track at 8 and confiscation, for instance. Yes, but do you know strategically where you should be looking most? Where is that risk? Where is it likely to come from? Is the intel feeding that? Are the investigators working on it? Is this what the prosecutors are focusing on? Well, no, they're focusing on something else because they thought that was where the risk lay. It's deeply problematic if this bit isn't absolutely spot on. And what I would say about this is when we're thinking about risk, that materiality piece is really, really important. And I go beyond the materiality issues for sector and encourage people to think beyond your sector. Contextually, what does this mean? Culturally, geographically, plug in all those extra factors to make that materiality calculation, because that is a really, really important part of defining your risk. I think the other part is really, I've said it once, it really bears repeating, one voice. It has to be consistent. And the third and final point in the storytelling, and it's critical that this is right too, is honesty and mitigation. Because often that's where the best stories come. Okay. The triumph over hardship. I'll give you a skiing analogy. Everyone looks like a champion on a powder day, but when the weather closes in and the ice is there, you can't see in front of you. It's that which really marks out the superstar from the weekend warrior.
And don't, as a jurisdiction, ignore that as part of your narrative. Don't pretend everything's rosy.
Absolutely. It's those adversities, the overcoming of those adversities is something to be very proud of and to tell as part of the story, because they will know about them.
That's a really good point. And Goerge, if I can bring you in, so particularly, think about your experience. Where have you seen this work not so well, maybe in some jurisdictions? Then tell us about where it's worked well.
Yeah, so to go to the last round of evaluations, and I know Liam said she wasn't going to name them, but I will, if that's okay. This is all public, by the way, in FATF, FSRB and MONEYVAL reports. There's a clear distinction of countries who managed to address risk well and who didn't. And the first thing to say is where they didn't address risk well, everything behind immediate outcome one fell down, because everything that supports what goes on in supervision, prosecutions, it's not based on risk. So you can't usually get above a moderate rating. So we consider substantial or high ratings to be pass ratings, and lows and moderates are kind of fails. So to give a couple of examples from different parts of the world, you see some good examples in the likes of Bermuda, the likes of Liechtenstein, and the likes of Jersey and Guernsey, both of whom did significant risk work. Also critically, as you've said, identifying areas where there were weaknesses. Weaknesses are not a problem in evaluations. It's just if you identify the weaknesses and then you have a plan to address them. Now, going to the bad, most of the issues with those ones that were negative last time were those jurisdictions that didn't accurately identify weaknesses. And in some situations, those weaknesses were globally well publicized. So how they thought that was going to kind of pull off was beyond me. Some of these were quite early in the round, and I would caveat to say some of these jurisdictions have certainly learnt lessons. But good examples of where that occurred is probably in the examples of Gibraltar, I think, were not quite as honest as they could have been in terms of particularly the risks associated with their banking industry and the e-gaming sector. That has significantly improved, actually, with a very recently republished Gibraltar risk assessment. The Cayman Islands, I think the first time round, did not do as much work on risk as they could have done. Something that was prevalent during the entire of the Cayman Islands report discussion was that when you look at the amount of funds administered in the Cayman Islands, globally, it places them as one of the globally largest funds jurisdictions in the world. And the position that was taken was that actually they didn't consider that this in even any area of the work presented significant risk. Now, I think it's fair to say that's not kind of a reasonable position. And finally, and more recently, is the report of the British Virgin Islands, who've just been listed. Again, they've done a very recent set of risk work, much to react too late to the situation, after they've been listed almost. And they didn't recognize the significance of the exposure of their international business companies worldwide, which I think probably many people in this room would have realized. So this is kind of examples of where narrative is really important. And just to stress some of the points that have been made before, that the narrative isn't one person saying it. In fact, the assessment process involves the assessment team speaking to different authorities separately and together. And they need to hear that message consistently throughout. So I just really endorse Liam's presentation that this is a whole island effort, public, private sector, across the authorities.
And in a discussion about with colleagues around kind of what actually happens on the ground, one of my more learned colleagues reminded me that the first thing any assessor would do, first thing any of us would do, is they kind of open up a search engine and they go, Isle of Man. That's kind of fair, isn't it? That's the sort of baseline. And so it's back to that point, don't hide stuff. It's there, it's out there, respond to it and be honest. Is that a fair?
Entirely. And I would say, and they're yet to publish guidance of what you can use AI for or not in evaluation processes. But put it this way, deep research will allow assessors to go far further, far quicker using Copilot or something. And you should expect, it's been the case for evaluations, that anything that's in the media about you or anything that's published could be asked in the evaluation. And so that's a normal thing. I imagine if you're a firm, a global firm, you would do the same if you were going into any environment where someone would ask you about it. The jurisdiction needs to think the same thing.
Thanks. Shannon, I guess we've heard a lot about risk, talked about risk in different forms and context. So as a supervisor, what are the kind of expectations, what are your expectations for the industry as to understanding of risk and how that is then considered as part of that evaluation process?
So we've talked about risk at a national level quite in depth this morning. And the same applies at a supervisory level and at an institutional level. So those national risks that we've identified through the national risk assessment process, evaluators will want to see how that's been incorporated into our own risk frameworks. So from a supervisory perspective, we would be expected to adapt our supervisory approach in line with the risks that have been identified. So focusing inspections, supervisory activities on higher risk areas, amending our risk assessment methodologies internally to the national risks that have been identified, the frequency and intensity of ongoing monitoring of institutions, that needs to be in line with risk. And obviously that needs to be integrated into the measures that are applied. So from an institutional level and what we would expect to see from businesses, we would expect to see alignment between institutional risk assessments, so your business risk assessments, and the findings of the national risk assessment. So the AML code and the gambling code, they both incorporate the legal requirement to take a risk-based approach. So that involves having a business risk assessment that's reviewed periodically and that considers all the relevant risk factors. Involves incorporating that into your technology risk assessments and your customer risk assessments. So if there are particular risks that have been identified, ensuring that any kind of scoring models or controls have been updated accordingly in line with those risks. And like supervisors, any kind of risk assessment methodologies that you use internally, so how you kind of score clients or how that weighting works, you would be expected to be able to articulate that to an assessor as well. Another really important thing is ensuring that the board and senior management are involved in risk understanding, and that that's not restricted to compliance teams or, junior compliance staff. That needs to be a tone set from the top, and that needs to be aligned with, it needs to be shown in the kind of day-to-day operations of the business. So how resources are kind of allocated accordingly. And again, I think someone's already mentioned as well, kind of looking beyond just our own national risk assessment. So the gambling code, for example, requires looking at our own national risk assessment and the national risk assessment of any jurisdictions that operators have links to. So being mindful of those things as well. And one final thing that I'll just kind of touch on is ensuring that risk understanding cascades to the wider business and isn't, again, just restricted to the compliance area. So frontline staff know what those trends and those typologies are that they need to look out for. So making sure that things like the FIU typologies document and any key themes from the national risk assessment are incorporated into staff training.
Kind of strikes me actually that you think about the national approach, IO1, and how the risk has to cascade right through in the narrative. Actually, that's almost an exactly replicated approach within a company and a corporate structure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jilly, we have talked about risk, and can you just tell me a little bit about what's different in the sixth round with the national risk assessment? Because I think we all here in NRA, we're talking about the national risk assessment, but it's quite fundamentally different in approach this time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the previous national risk assessments, as you know, they were money laundering and terrorist financing all combined. The approach that we're taking for this round is a bottom-up approach. So we're looking at our sectoral pieces and we're building them up then into our money laundering national risk assessment. We also have our separate pieces. So you will have seen our terrorist financing national risk assessment published recently. And then we will have some separate ones. So our NPO risk assessment, proliferation financing risk assessments, and they'll be coming out through the rest of the year.
And I think hopefully colleagues will see some comfort. I know the FSA has requested huge amounts of data, but that data is used as part. It doesn't just kind of disappear into a black hole in somebody's computer and kept in a spreadsheet and never looked at again. That is fundamental to this process of national risk assessment, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The data that we have at the moment is so comprehensive, and it really builds the picture that we have and our understanding in those national risk assessments. And then you can incorporate those into your businesses. So once again, thank you very much for all of your data that you've submitted. I know it's been a difficult time for lots of you in submitting that data, but it really does build on the picture that we have.
Can I just dive into a couple of kind of practicalities, really? So we're preparing for the mutual evaluation. It's October 26th. Can you just sort of fire off some key dates that we really all need to know about?
Absolutely. So in November this year, we have the official start of the evaluation. So that's our country training. So we'll have MONEYVAL come over. There'll be about 2 members of the Secretariat visit the Isle of Man, and they will provide some training sessions, both for industry and for all of the authorities. So the way that those will work is we'll have the industry sessions in the morning, and they will present the FATF and the methodology and how the whole process works. And then in the later half of the day and the second day, the authorities will then present their evidence and their kind of showcase the work that they've been doing in relation to their specific IOs. And then the Secretariat will provide feedback on that. And then we can use that to build upon how we are going to evidence our submissions. Then we move into March, which will be our first submission. So this is our technical compliance. So this is our frameworks, our legislation, and it's also our risk and context. So this is where we will share our national risk assessment, our materiality. So if we look at the sectors that we have, we'll share with them how material they are. Now, this is very important in an assessment, because if there are deficiencies found in sectors, we need to be able to show how material or immaterial that deficiency is. We'll then move into June, where we will submit our effectiveness questionnaire. So this is the largest and the most important submission. We want to make sure that we have all of the evidence possible in this submission to make sure that the assessment team are able to assess well before they land on site. Next, they will share with us a scoping note. So this is the key areas in which the assessment team will focus on. So this is key for us before they land in October for the on-site, because this is where we will know where they want to focus and where we can put our efforts in, essentially, and look to decrease any deficiencies that they might already be identifying. Then we have October 2026. This is the on-site, which you'll hear us talk about, and you'll probably be bored of hearing about it by the time October comes. But this is what we need to prepare for. This is where where industry will meet the assessment team, and they'll be asked the questions, they'll be interviewed, and the authorities will also. This is where the key consistent messaging comes in that we've been speaking about, making sure that we all have a consistent narrative and that we are all able to sing from the same hymn sheet, essentially.
So,
I thought you were about to ask a question then, Dan.
Can I just ask, straw poll, I'm going to build on Liam's audience participation. How many people have been involved from an industry perspective in a previous MONEYVAL evaluation? Hands up. Probably not the majority. So this is kind of new ground for many of us. So it's super important that we get this narrative. And how are industry selected, and then kind of what happens when you're selected?
So the process starts fairly early on. So from January next year, as per the rules of procedure within FATF and MONEYVAL, we should find out our official dates. So this is the 3 weeks in October when we'll have the on-site. About 6 months out, we'll be discussing, we'll be providing a list of entities, probably a large list of entities that could be selected by MONEYVAL for the interviews. They can choose from that list. They can choose from outside of that list. But we should have a good indication a few months out on who they will choose. Now, it can change, and industry members may be called upon quite close to the evaluation. So the plan is to make sure that everybody is prepared, everybody understands their kind of what they need to do and what to expect. And then in that way, we are all prepared and ready for those interviews.
Okay. Liam, how have you seen jurisdictions manage that tension between the need, and you referred to it briefly, the need for compliance, especially under this sixth round, and that tension between allowing businesses to flourish, and I guess over the next 12 months, we're going to see a ramping up of pressure, regulation. We're going to see a ramping up around policies, consultations, and how do we manage that tension between the need to comply with international standards, but the need as an international financial centre to support and encourage businesses to grow and develop?
You've got to manage this tension extremely carefully. I've already referenced the de-risking issue. It's a real possibility if the reaction, the response to evaluation is so brutal, so aggressive that it stifles the economy, then the overall objective hasn't really been achieved, because you might have not eliminated, I should stress, but you might have significantly reduced the threat, but then there's no real theatre for everybody else to operate in. That you're into territory where people literally, the ordinary man on the street, cannot open a bank account. And I've worked in jurisdictions recently where that has become the case. So I think this interface between industry and the regulators and the professional bodies is critical. Professional body and regulatory participation in any FATF events possible, also incredibly valuable to keep feeding back into the process. What does work, what doesn't work, what is overindulging a particular issue, for example. It is an incredibly difficult line really to walk. I think overall it's the collaboration that we've talked about all morning which should help guard against it overtaking everybody's thinking. That I admit I've spoken today as if everybody in this room only had one task, and it was this. It's not, and we're all very much alive to that. But we're all very much alive to the fact too that the two are utterly interdependent. So keep collaborating would be my number one piece of advice.
George, in Jersey, how did you handle that sort of increased tension and pressure as you got closer to MONEYVAL?
So I think there's always a tension here, as Liam's outlined, in relation to the increase of pressure and oversight and regulation versus the need to maintain a competitive business environment. For what it's worth, I think roughly around the evaluation cycle, I think every jurisdiction goes through this, and there are ebbs and flows of how this goes. The right route to deal with it is communication, and also to continue discussing openly with the supervisor, with the government, with the FIU, with the forums, where you are finding pain points. Also, there has been kind of increased reaction from the FATF over the years. About 4 years ago, the FATF started a project called Unintended Consequences of the FATF Standards, because of exactly what was occurring. And in some of the countries that both Liam and I work in, we saw whole-scale de-risking where people cannot access the formal financial system. Now, that is negative because more money goes underground, more financial crime is disguised. And that has now been realised. So actually, we're required now, authorities are required to take this into account. So there is a balance. So I think, again, it's communication. In Jersey, we certainly saw that. There were different sectors that were affected at different times. There are still challenges in working through new regulatory areas. And I would be lying if I didn't say that won't continue in every jurisdiction. I think communication is key, and realising this, it's an ever turning wheel of change, I think.
Thanks. We've got loads of Slido questions. I am going to just go onto them quickly. But Shannon, just before, can you just tell me a little bit about how the GSC itself is kind of looking to enhance collaboration and cooperation with industry? And, we're going to talk about King Gaming in just a minute. And I would say, it is a live criminal investigation. It's being investigated by the independent authorities in the Isle of Man, the constabulary, and the prosecutions team. So we're not going to talk in any detail about the specifics of an ongoing investigation. But, how are you enhancing collaboration and cooperation at the GSC, Shannon?
So in terms of enhancing cooperation, that's being looked at from various angles. So we've talked about with the private sector. Firstly, Terry's presentation this morning, he spoke about the launch of a Isle of Man Financial Crime Partnership game group focused on online gaming. And I think we were really keen to make sure that that was a kind of fusion group, because due to the nature of the gambling sector, it does intersect with so many other industries and different types of businesses. I think it's really important to have that holistic picture. So that will be a really important kind of piece moving forwards in terms of understanding our risks and making sure that any outputs of that group kind of meet industry's needs. We also have the quarterly gambling AML forum for MLROs. That is driven by data from inspections, from quarterly returns, but it's also driven by feedback from industry. So the GSC are really keen to know what would be beneficial for operators, and that kind of feeds into the types of topics that we include in those forums. The GSC also has started drop-in sessions, so kind of in an informal setting for operators to come in and discuss any matters of mutual interest. That can be entirely led by operators, or they can be kind of focused on a specific area like SARS or enhanced due diligence or something like that. So that's something that is progressing well. And obviously through those kind of various channels, we'll always kind of take feedback from industry. We're also looking at cooperation from a kind of domestic agency perspective as well. So there's been a significant amount of work looking at how we work with other agencies and strengthening those arrangements in place. So a few months ago, the GSC established a new data sharing agreement with the constabulary, which has kind of enhanced the information sharing through those channels. And in addition to that, we also work with other agencies. There was the enactment of the permitted disclosures order a few months ago as well. So again, that increases where we can share information with other government agencies, and that helps with our ongoing supervision. And then from an international perspective as well, the GSC is keen to work with other regulators and share best practice. So we've engaged with regulators in other jurisdictions. We've recently got a member of the GSC is now part of a FATF working group looking at casinos. So trying to kind of get that knowledge from as widely as we can and incorporate it into our own kind of supervision and kind of how we relate with other agencies and
I guess that speaks back again to the first presentation we had from FBI colleagues around how you take a long view of the operation of certain entities where they may be operating in a different jurisdiction. So thanks so much, Shannon. That's great. So let's move on to Slido. And we've talked a little bit about gaming, and obviously we're all aware of King Gaming. And so, Jilly, I guess how will the King Gaming matter affect our forthcoming evaluation?
I think it's really key to come back to Liam's point here and say how we can use these type of investigations and these type of matters as an opportunity to showcase how we can learn from any challenges that we have and what we can do then to put in place the measures to avoid this happening, and use this as an opportunity into moving forward. So if we think about the work that's been ongoing for all of the agencies across the board. We have increased collaboration, as Shannon has mentioned. We have published our national risk appetite statement. We've had statements from the minister, and we're incorporating all of this into our national risk assessment as well. And then we can start to push out those recommended actions from those risk assessments, and then work on the risk-based approach on how we can adapt and overcome any challenges that we've seen from these matters. So in relation to the evaluation, an evaluation isn't won or lost on one case or one component. There are many, many different components to an evaluation. So we can take this as an opportunity to showcase the good work that we have done, and essentially, it's the evaluation isn't going to be won or lost on one case.
So the next question on the screen, it's going to be quite challenging to answer. We don't have colleagues here from law enforcement or prosecutions, and I would say that so does the Isle of Man government think that the lack of prosecutions in relation to money laundering, particularly those involving criminals resident outside the island, will be a material failure of that objective? So that directly relates to an immediate outcome and result in grey listing. And, just before I hand back, I might ask Goerge to speak a little bit about that. These are incredibly complex prosecutions which take huge amounts of time. And I know the government has recently invested £1.5 million in the proactive international money laundering team. And that has been a huge boost to that team. But it's still a relatively small team, and they are dealing with cases that the NCA would be expected to investigate, on those scales. So these are transnational, international money laundering cases, which are incredibly sophisticated and span several jurisdictions. And there are a number of cases ongoing, which we're not going to talk about. But Goerge, it's not just about seeing the prosecution at the end, is it? Often the assessors will welcome a discussion around what's in the pipeline almost.
Correct. So I can't speak on behalf of the Isle of Man government, but what I can say is about how the standards apply. So immediate outcome 7, where this would be considered, doesn't simply look at prosecutions. It looks at investigations as well, and how it links with IO6, which is around financial intelligence, how financial intelligence leads to successful investigations and prosecutions. Now, take the example in Jersey to give an example. That's an area where we have no prosecutions along the basis of the risk profile reported in the report. But what was looked at and is reported is the mechanism for effective investigation. So what happens is they look behind the prosecution part and look at investigations. And the point you make, Dan, is international financial centres often face cases that are extremely complex. The FBI example this morning was a good one, which did involve a number of other international financial centres. These are not short cases to investigate. They require numerous amounts of time in investigation, mutual legal assistance, and bringing to court. So the immediate outcome is deliberately drafted to be broader. So there will be detailed discussions with the assessment team around how the mechanisms for investigation work. But just because there are no prosecutions, that does not mean that that's a single pass or fail in the evaluation. And just to highlight the point that Jilly mentioned as well, no single thing will result in a pass or fail. It's what ultimately ends up in a negative report is an accumulation of issues. So that would be the point I'd make there.
Thanks. I'm just going to jump into Liam here, and can you clarify more on speaking with the same voice and consistent storytelling? Are we allowed to have differing views? Slightly provocative question. Difference of opinion will not be tolerated.
Great question. I encourage you to voice your individual concerns, and you have. So I think when we're talking about one voice, we're talking about objectives. Each industry will have its own nuances. Each firm within that industry will also have a whole new set of things which are unique to them and their offering. And for that reason, I don't think we're talking about a script here. No, for a start, a script is deeply uncompelling and it leaves you wondering what the truth is. So we're not talking about a script, but it's recognizing those common objectives. And it's endeavoring to ensure that the narrative you provide is in line with those objectives and not So whilst I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that it should be scripted, I would urge you to think hard about pursuing any maverick thought process, a kind of experimenting with it on the day of your interview. If you have concerns, sit down with your body or with the regulator, with law enforcement at FCP, discuss them. I don't think it's not the time for deep philosophical debate on how you think a particular organisation or sector should move.
That's perfect. Thank you. So just kind of building on that a little bit, Jilly, there's a question on Slido that says that MONEYVAL is a European body and these bodies are not favourable to the Isle of Man. So how can we be sure we're getting a fair hearing? And we've heard that before, haven't we, around, the political element to that process. It's not an entirely neutral process at times.
I think one thing to consider really with MONEYVAL and the evaluations, they're called a mutual evaluation. So it's not actually the MONEYVAL Secretariat that are evaluating you. It's our peers in the other member states of MONEYVAL. So they will evaluate us. We have assessors that have evaluated other countries. So it's a peer review essentially. It's a mutual evaluation. I personally worked in the Secretariat, so I can, vouch for the policies and procedures and the rules of procedure that are in place to ensure that this is a fair process. So absolutely, it is a fair process, and I think we don't need to be caught up on the perception of MONEYVAL and what they think of the Isle of Man. It
goes back to narrative really in some ways, in setting the tone and the context right at the start with the evaluators.
Absolutely.
So there's an interesting question here that says, does the government have a planned strategy should we be listed after the MONEYVAL evaluation? And those of us who've been around a bit, and I know there are certain colleagues here, will recall that the Isle of Man was placed in enhanced follow-up in the last evaluation round, and that was a challenging time for everybody. And in fact, I was recently speaking to a colleague from a country in Southwest Africa who was explaining the pain they were going through from greylisting, which felt, he said, Kafkaesque at times in terms of things changing, the need to develop legislation at really short notice, the need to kind of really de-risk very quickly, which is probably the opposite of what we're trying to achieve here in terms of that balanced approach. And I suppose, Jilly, I'm going to go back to you again. I think the first plan is, we've got the playbook from last time we were enhanced follow-up, but the plan is not to fail, right?
Absolutely. We definitely don't want to be placed in on the grey list, but I think we can take it back a step, really. Every jurisdiction that undertakes a mutual evaluation will have recommended actions. The changes now in the 6th round are that there will be key recommended actions and recommended actions. So there is no jurisdiction that will not have any recommended actions. It depends on how well they do, essentially, on the severity of those recommended actions. We will know fairly early on, so from our first draft of the mutual evaluation, which will land with us in around December, January time, we will have a clear indication then of the sort of conclusions made by the assessment team. And at that stage then we can start to perhaps look at recommendations that we can implement earlier on, or recommendations that might take a little longer to implement. Maybe it might be legislation changes or something along those lines. But we can start to implement them very early on. So we're not going to get to a stage where we're at the plenary in May 2027 and then all of a sudden we don't know what the plan is. So just a key point on this, that it may feel for industry that it kind of goes radio silence after your interviews. Now, this is part of the rules of procedure. We are unable to give feedback and unable to provide you with kind of the conclusions from the mutual evaluation until it is published. until it is published. So this will be in 2027. I just want to make that clear to everybody, that if it feels like you've done your job and you've had your interviews, but yet you don't hear anything back, that is the way that it has to happen as part of the procedures.
It's really valuable feedback, actually. Thank you. So let's nip back into that discussion around e-gaming, Shannon, and how will the presence of e-gaming in the island affect our assessment, if at all? And what are GSC doing to prepare? And I think this goes back to a point George made earlier around, I think it was the Cayman Islands and the fund management, and kind of just going, well, that's just a thing we do. It's not really risky. So Shannon, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so in terms of the impact on the evaluation, I think we've already discussed that no single kind of agency or area will lead to kind of success or failure of the evaluation. It's very much a collective view of our AML framework, and it's kind of like a puzzle. Everyone has their kind of, each piece represents a kind of vital part of it, and it does take a kind of broader view of the framework as a whole, as opposed to an agency or sectoral level. In terms of the next round, we've talked about how it'll be a lot more focused on risk and materiality. So to that degree, we can expect that e-gaming will be a focus for the assessment team. So the assessors will look at kind of how we have responded to risk. I think that's the main thing that we need to ensure we've done everything that we can to respond to those risks, and like Jilly said, to prevent the cases that we've kind of touched on kind of occurring again. So also another kind of point, online gambling, so casinos, they are assessed under immediate outcome 4, which looks at all designated non-financial businesses and professions. So it will be kind of viewed within the scope of non-financial businesses as a whole. But given the kind of materiality of the sector, it will be kind of weighted heavily to online gaming. So in terms of what the GSC has done to kind of respond to those risks, there's been a significant amount of work. You will have seen recently there was a consultation on the GSC bill, so updating various gambling acts, the AML Act, and trying to strengthen them to strengthen our effectiveness and our supervisory effectiveness, how we share information with other agencies, making sure that our entry controls are strong and are risk-based, having kind of clear legal basis for risk-based licensing decisions. So they're all kind of really important to kind of demonstrate how we've responded to those risks. We've talked about the enhanced information sharing and collaboration with other agencies. I've touched on kind of the market entry controls. So IO4 will look at, as one of the key components it looks at, is kind of what controls are in place to keep bad actors out of the sector. And there's been a significant amount of work looking at the processes in place. So the tools that we use, the sources of information that we use to ensure that they're as strong as they can be. We've worked closely with the FSA to kind of share best practice and make sure that we're aligned in terms of what we use. The understanding of risk is a really key one. We've talked about how that kind of underpins all the activities that we undertake. So the work on the national risk assessment and a gambling sectoral risk assessment, that is also complemented by a thematic internal risk review, which has been underway for a number of months. That's kind of looked at the wider estate, and that has kind of generated our kind of response as well. So how kind of supervisory activities have been targeted, and prioritizing inspections and enhanced measures. So that's kind of had a direct impact as well. So there's been a significant amount of things underway. Kind of generally speaking, in terms of resourcing, a significant change from the last round is that the GSC has a dedicated AML inspections team as well. So that's been separated from the general supervision function. We've got a dedicated enforcement team. So there is kind of adequate resource and trained staff to look at those key areas and to make sure that there is a specific focus on AML. And I think that's kind of the main things. I'm looking at my notes.
That's perfect. No, you've given a great overview. Thank you, Shannon. And I guess, back to your point right at the start, Liam, it's that golden thread, isn't it? Yeah. From something that happened through to and here's what we did. And importantly, from an effectiveness perspective, and this was the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. So a slightly leading question, which I'll put to Goerge in the first instance. I feel everybody else is slightly conflicted in that matter, and you can give us a broad answer and maybe reflect on your experience in Jersey. But it's been mentioned several times that this forthcoming assessment shouldn't impact innovation and growth. Do you think we've got the balance right as a jurisdiction?
So, slightly coming back to this is kind of linked to the de-risking point, but the other side of the scale. I think it's recognised across the FATF. Sorry. I think it's recognised across the FATF that countries need to develop strong economies and strong business systems. Just because you're pushing certain types of financial or non-financial products, that will not impact your evaluation. What will impact your evaluation if you're not managing and mitigating the risks that come by entering those markets. Now, the Isle of Man and the Isle of Man government, from what I've observed, do a huge amount to push the Isle of Man economy, and that's quite right. The same is true in Jersey, and to a certain extent also in Guernsey and in Alderney as well. That activity can continue. I think that the key thing that needs to happen is that there are risk mitigants in place, and that work has been being significantly enhanced in the last year. A really good example is the work I know that's going on at the moment around enhancing the e-gaming or iGaming sector alongside the risk appetite statement. Those things are able to exist together. Everyone actually wants the same end goal for this, which is growing the industry in a sustainable, risk mitigated way. So I think the balance is definitely there. At times, again, this will feel like a tension, and there is seriously a role for promotional bodies. I don't know of any successful international financial centre in the world that doesn't have, to some extent, a financial or other area promotional body that's going forward. The key when the evaluation comes will be to being able to mitigate it. So I think from what I'm seeing, the agencies, the promotional agencies alongside the regulators and other bodies are working together to get that balance right.
And I think the National Risk Appetite Statement on iGaming is really clear that it doesn't preclude that business, but what it says is, and I think this links back to an earlier question, if you're going to engage in a higher risk activity, then your risk appetite and your risk assessment right throughout the organisation needs to reflect that. Is that a fair assessment, Shannon?
Yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't kind of explicitly prohibit that type of business or business from, so it references Southeast Asia specifically, but it does state that there is a low appetite for that type of business within government. So providing, if that is the type of business that, you're seeking to engage in, you would need to be prepared to be subject to enhanced measures, enhanced due diligence, making sure that those policies and those controls are strong. So it would be a matter of kind of proportionality and making sure that you're aware that it would be kind of subject to enhanced supervision.
Perfect. Fantastic question next. I love this question. Liam, what role do you see the next generation of compliance professionals playing in strengthening the jurisdiction's story of effectiveness to bodies like MONEYVAL and FATF? I think it's great. It's about how we get involved and how kind of that next generation of people start to kind of tell the story, back to IO1, I guess.
I think the answer to this lies in the technical, if I'm really honest, because I think we can all see from our own day jobs that we're entering a space which is being increasingly overtaken by technology. So that story is only going to become more and more complex. and the next generation, which I think is absolutely the right term to use, to meet that challenge will be the one equipped to answer the questions and tell the story in often a very technical way. It's the persuasion will actually come in some instances through the products being applied, the risk machines that are at work, because by the time of the next evaluation, I think it's safe to say that AI will be playing such a significant role in everybody's day-to-day here, that expectations will have gone through the roof. George rightly pointed out that no self-respecting assessor is going to arrive in a jurisdiction historically without having done a lot of Googling. We know now that they'll be using all kinds of tooling. I think you can expect to see that accelerate beyond most of our imaginations by the time of the next evaluation. So I think a deeply technically equipped cohort is what's going to be necessary. I think, persuasion will only take you so far. Those data sets are going to look infinitely more complex as well. So yes, we look to the youth of today for the future of financial services, probably globally.
And that's a really interesting reflection, isn't it? With the rapid growth of fintech, the adoption of AI. How do you work with an assessor who perhaps isn't kind of at that level and explain your story as an organization as to what it means? I guess it's back to that narrative, plain English. What are we about as an organization?
Absolutely. It comes back to the fact that the story will remain at the absolute center of everything. I think it's fair to say that if you are conducting one of these assessments, your knowledge will be at the requisite level to have these conversations. Otherwise, the organization itself is doing it's doing a disservice to financial stability and global security. So I think we can have as high expectations of the assessors, and we should have, and we should make that plain, as we do of those who will be presenting our story next time around.
Thanks, Liam. I think this is the last question standing between us and lunch. So, Jilly, no pressure. And we'd like a written response to this. For those entities selected for interview, what format will this take? And importantly, what topics are going to be covered? And do you know what questions they're going to ask?
I wish I did. So in terms of the format, you will be selected for it'll probably be an hour, maybe 2 hour interview. So this will be with your assessor for IO3 or 4, depending on which sector you're in, and then some members from the assessment team and their secretariat members. It could be the entire assessment team, or it could just be those in the financial side of things. So the questions, like I say, unfortunately, we don't know, and we can't provide you with a script of what you should say. But the things to sort of prepare for are, firstly, your understanding of risk. So they will question you on, how do you understand money laundering in the Isle of Man? How does it affect your business? How well do you know the national risk assessments? How involved in the national risk assessment process were you? What's your relationship with the regulators? How often do they provide outreach to you? Do you find it useful? Also think about your inside your business, so your business risk assessments, your client risk assessments, and those type of things. In relation to who should attend, you want to make sure that you have the people there that are able to talk to the operational delivery of your business. So the ones that can answer about customer risk assessments, for example. if you're a larger firm, you probably are able to bring, 3 or 4 people across the sort of different levels within your organization. Smaller firms will find that more difficult, but make sure that these are the practitioners, the ones that can answer the real operational questions. That's where you'll get the most successful outcome.
Great. So, it's not an easy job being sat on the sofa and responding to the questions which pop into people's minds. But I'm sure you'd agree the panel did a fantastic job today. We could have gone on probably for another half an hour, but I think everybody's probably hungry and ready for lunch. So I'm going to say thank you so much, Shannon, Reid, Goerge, Pearmain, Leam Thompson and Jilly Christian. Could you put your hands together? Thank you.